Well, I hope everyone's had a great week, and lots happened in the nation this week, and lots still going to happen. When God promised a shaking, you know what? Shakings involve shaking, and He promised everything that can be shaken will, and what isn't founded on Him will fall. So expect a lot more shaking going on. That's all I can say in the days ahead and in different ways. But one of the areas that is going through shakings is in the church world. And you know what? There needs to be shaking there too. And because there's been a lot of mishandling of the Lord's bride, and people using it for different gimmicks to build careers, to build fortunes, to build a name for themselves, a brand, if you will. And I came across this little gimmick that is, give you an example of what I'm talking about. And the title is Pastor Claims to Have Seen Heaven and Takes Pics to Prove It. A South African preacher is claiming he was able to go to heaven and take pictures of paradise with his smartphone, by the way. But this story is not being received in the way that he expects. In fact, he is being ridiculed online for trying to sell photos of heaven. According to the BBC, this guy, whose name I can't pronounce, is the leader of the Church of Incredible Happenings. It sounds like he had one. Has made claims of incredible feats before. Before claiming to photograph the kingdom of heaven, the prophet has also claimed to deliver a fish from the womb of a pregnant woman. In a statement from the church spokesperson to a local newspaper, the pastor was captured, quote unquote, to heaven during an Easter Sunday service and took pictures on his Galaxy smartphone and came back down later that day. According to a report by some organization, in order to take a look at the images, a donation of 5,000 Rand, or about $340, is needed. In exchange, the images will be sent through WhatsApp to the donator. Social media users wasted no time reacting to his claim on Twitter. Jokes and memes were immediately posted on the site under the hashtag of his name. Some of the photos he claims to have gone to heaven and had pictures to prove it are leaked. And so people who got a hold of them have just started posting them on social media. And what they are is stock traditional pictures of what people think heaven would look like. And so, that's the kind of thing that needs to be shaken. And so gimmicks, we don't need them. And God's tired of it. And so he's letting the shaking take place. So let's look at today in Ephesians chapter 4. We're going to get back into Ephesians and hopefully wrap it up pretty soon. Ephesians chapter 4, if you remember Ephesus was a very prosperous city, an older city. It was the main city in Asia Minor in Paul's day. It was not the capital, but it was the most important city because it was the first city people came to when they came into Asia Minor from the Mediterranean. They had a massive man-made harbor. You had to go up the Cayster River about 5 miles, and then you would take a man-made inlet for about a mile to a huge man-made harbor that would host 100 ships at the time. And so these docks were constantly full of ships coming in and out because everything that came into Asia Minor came through Ephesus. Be that goods, be that military, be that political people, be that philosophy, religion, everything. The saying was, if it won't work in Ephesus, it won't work here. And so everything had to be established first in Ephesus before it would spread into Asia Minor. And that's why Paul started there. And so Paul goes there around 52 AD, and when he arrives there, there is no Christian influence in the city at all. There's a small Jewish population, everybody else pagan. And every pagan religion was welcome there, as long as everybody understood Diana was on top. She was the top god because she was the patron goddess of the city. And so the large temple to Diana was located there, massive temple complex that today all you can see is the foundation of it. But back then it was a massive complex that housed government offices. And so they didn't have separation of church and state. They were all one. And that's because paganism ruled the culture. Paganism was what created the cultural worldview, if you will. Everything was somehow or another attached to the gods. Even the people who worked there, to work in Ephesus, if you were a tradesman, you had to be a member of a local union. They called them guilds. Every guild had a patron god. And so when they had their guild meetings or union meetings, it began with worship of their deity, whoever that was, who was their patron god. Then they would have their meeting. Then they would close their meeting by breaking out the alcohol and sending in the girls. And every meeting ran the same way. So this is something you can put down and put on your refrigerator. Idolatry and immorality always go together. And so when you see one, you're going to see the other. Well, this was Ephesus. It was very wealthy, like I said. The old city, it had been founded several hundred years earlier. It had always been an important city because the Greeks were actually one who founded it way, way back, and they had invested a lot of money there. When Rome took over, they invested a lot of money there. So you had a city that was constantly growing. Well, in this environment, Paul lands and he's walking the streets, and all he probably sees the stores, because there was 3 main roads through Ephesus. Chances are he took the main street that came off of the docks and went down to the Colosseum. And so when you walk down that main street, you would pass all these stores and temples and all kinds of stuff going on down the streets. The streets were lined with statues to either Greek heroes or gods. And so he saw all of this, and it's in this environment he starts preaching to the Gentiles. Well, he's there 2 to 3 years, we're not exactly sure. And by the time he leaves, there's a thriving church there. So he's gone. In his absence, he left Timothy there to pastor. In his absence, though, the people came under intense persecution. The persecution was based primarily on social isolation. And so what happened was, since the Christians stopped giving alms and paying homage to Diana, you had to do that to get into the city market, or what they called the agora. So when you walked through a gate, there was an altar there to Diana, and you had to pay homage to her, put some incense on her altar before they would let you proceed and go on in and do your business. Christians wouldn't do it. So they told Christians, you're not welcome here anymore. So that would be kind of like you going to Walmart and them saying, hey, you're a Christian, you can't come here anymore. Now in Dothan, that wouldn't cramp your style too much, but if you were in a city where that was the main thing, and they said, you're not welcome here anymore, unless you're going to get back in line with the culture. Well, so they were having hardships from that, because they were having to go outside the city to conduct commerce. And those who were part of the trade guilds, who were the tradesmen, were kicked out of the guilds. because they said, if you're not going to go along with us, you don't need to be here. Well, when they got kicked out of their unions, they lost their jobs and they couldn't get hired. So you had a lot of economic hardship going on. You had the fact that people who were their neighbors, who they used to socialize with, were now treating them like they didn't exist because they had been basically, to use our terminology, canceled. And in this environment, when Paul ends up in under house arrest around 62 AD, he learns about what's going on and that a group of people claiming to be Christians have infiltrated the church who were called the Nicolaitans. The Nicolaitans were Gnostics. And so they were telling these Christians who were under the fire of persecution, you don't have to go through this. Go along with the culture. It's okay. God understands you don't really mean it, so go ahead and put your incense on the altar to Diana, or participate in idol worship again. Just in your heart, you know you don't mean it. God knows you don't mean it. He understands. You got to do what you got to do to get along. And so this was causing a lot of pressure. The outside pressure they could handle. Have you noticed? In fact, I was watching Chuck Missler yesterday talking about Acts, and he said, you know, external persecution never shut down the church. It just makes it grow. It makes it spread out. He said it's the internal persecution that rots it away, or the internal influences. And so this internal influence was the one that really concerned Paul. Because the Gnostics were teaching there's a spiritual part of life and then there's the normal part, or they would call it natural part. I just call it normal part. Francis Schaeffer calls that the two-story house, where you have an upper floor that is where your spiritual practices reside and beliefs reside, and a lower floor, which is the public you, the normal you, that comes in contact with the outside world and engages with people. All your spiritual stuff's supposed to be reserved up here on this private part of life. On the lower floor, a different you engages the world. So you act like the world, get along with the world, but up here, as long as you got this private side of life, that's okay. Well, that was Greek Gnosticism. Well, when Paul learns about this, he decides it's time to write. So he writes a letter to the Ephesian Christians that's going to become a circular letter and make its way all the way around Asia Minor to the churches he's part of. But this letter opens, as all of his do, with theology, but then transitions into practicals. Okay? And so the primary thrust of his theology to them is he reminds them of the big story of redemption. Because he's taught them all of this before, but he's concerned that they're forgetting, that they're under such pressure to conform to their culture and to the pagan ideas of their culture. He's concerned that they're going to forget what they've been taught. And so for those first 3 chapters, he's been reminding them of the big plan of redemption. This is God's plan all along, that Jesus was going to come and make redemption possible. And he reminds them of what that means. He reminds them of what it means for them to be believers now. That they've been made right with God, that he's done away with the wall of division between Jew and Gentile, that now what matters is in Christ or not. And so he sets this huge backdrop, and then in chapter 4, where we are today, he's going to begin the transition into the practicals. Now, here's the theory. Here are the concepts. This is how you apply them. Okay? Now, in education, we call that, anybody know what we call that term? That methodology? Close. Praxis. Praxis. Praxis is when you take a concept and actually put it into practice to demonstrate mastery over that skill. Okay? So it's one thing to say, this is how you teach kids math. You take that and then you go into the classroom and actually do it. And you're going to do it and do it and do it and do it until it becomes second nature. That's practice. See, there's more. That's what the discipleship model is based on, is praxis. Discipleship is not just memorizing a bunch of Bible verses. Everybody can do that and should do that, but that's not discipleship. That's memorization. Praxis is taking what you've learned and putting it into application and practice. All right. Chapter 4, verse 1. So Paul in this letter is really giving them what we could call a Christian worldview. And now he's going to explain the practicals of how that worldview works. Verse 1. As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. So Paul refers to himself as a prisoner, not a prisoner of Rome, which he was, but a prisoner of the Lord. Paul recognized, and this is why, Paul recognized that whatever his circumstances, there was some way to redeem the time for the kingdom of God. So he's sitting in his house, can't go anywhere. He faces a choice. What am I going to do with my time? He didn't know when he was going to go before the emperor to be tried. So he could have just sat back and said, well, catch up on the old Reader's Digest and just kind of sit around and enjoy the sunshine and say, I deserve a couple of years off here and I'm just going to relax and enjoy life. And he could have done that. The soldiers didn't care that were chained to him what he did because he was a Roman citizen, so they were very limited in what they could do to him. But instead, because he saw himself as a prisoner of the Lord, he decided to redeem the time. So instead of just sitting around doing nothing, he got busy. And they allowed him to have visitors, which as a Roman citizen he could do. So he had people coming to him to get ministry. He was teaching his preacher boys, like he had taught Timothy, he had taught Titus, Epaphras, who's going to be the one who founds the church in Colossae. And he's teaching these guys. He has ministry going on. And then he starts writing his letters. And that's where you get the prison epistles from. It's during this time when he's just sitting there awaiting trial. Instead of just sitting there or sitting there worried to death. Oh, what's going to happen? Oh, what's going to happen? Oh, my goodness. Oh. No, it's time to write. And so he started writing out his letters. He redeemed the time. Now, if he were a prisoner of his circumstance, he'd have probably done something else. But he realized what God had done was gave him a break from a busy schedule to do some needful things. God will do the same with us. There are times that we don't understand why things happen the way they happen. That there are times that God will put a break in your life to give you time to do some needful things that if you didn't have that break, you would never get to. Okay? Boy, y'all got excited. Oh, I forgot my button. I was going to bring my button today. Forgot. All right, so, and then he says, he says to live worthy of the calling. And so what he's demonstrating here is how to do that. He's living worthy of his calling. He's not just sitting around worried, fretting, lazy. He's not like the steward who took what was given to him and buried it because he was afraid or whatever. No, he said living worthy is redeeming the time. Well, he goes on to say, I wrote this. I pointed this out because we may be tempted to only think of living worthy as behavioral conduct, and it is included, but living worthy involves our focus in life too. And Paul's focus was to advance the kingdom. So Paul instructed that the readers live worthy of the calling they had received. What was this calling? Well, in chapter 1, he identifies the calling as the calling of salvation, where he said we've been called by God to salvation. He mentions, he used the word worthy to describe living in a way, and the word means living in a way that is suitable or recognized as fitting. In other words, if you're going to live worthy of that calling, it's to live in a way that shows you've received that calling. Don't live contrary to the calling. Another application is to live in a manner that matches one's actual value. So he's saying you can't just do whatever you want to, live however you want to, if you're going to live in a way that's worthy of the calling to salvation, the calling that we've been given. Verse 2, be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and one Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. So that pretty well covers all the bases. Overall, in all, through all. What's left? Nothing. So it's what he's talking about is something that permeates all of life and every aspect of life. So Paul describes conduct that reveals the fruit of the Spirit and the value of unity. But for Paul was mindful of the need for unity in the local ecclesias. Now, he talks about unity here, but he talks about unity here not as we sometimes think of unity. We may think of unity as, okay, we're going to have unity. We're going to have a joint meeting one Sunday night where all of us different churches get together, and we can probably get it out one night. And we have our common service, and everybody leaves patting themselves on the back. Boy, we had such unity there tonight. That's not what he's talking about at all. Tolerating each other is not unity. Okay? So what is he talking about? Isn't it interesting that in verse 4 and 5, he bases unity on theology. He doesn't base unity on, well, we'll all get together and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. He bases it on a common theology. And he says, if you look back in verse 4, he noticed the basis of unity was a common theology about the nature of God, which is when he says one Lord, core beliefs, the one faith, the common ordinances, which is the one baptism, and an understanding of the thorough sovereignty of God. So where there's disagreement, and there can be disagreement over secondary doctrines and methodologies, that's okay. You know, unity is not based on, well, we agree with each other on baptism. Baptism is important, but how a person baptized is a secondary doctrine. Okay? So that's not something to break unity over, to break fellowship over. You can disagree with somebody on that and still walk with them. You can disagree with somebody over whether Christians should go to movies or not. Now, there's some Christians who would say if you go to a movie, you're going to bust hell wide open. Well, I don't know where they get that from, but that, you know, you can still disagree with somebody on that and be in unity with them and be in fellowship with them. If they say Jesus was not the Son of God, we don't have any unity. We don't have any fellowship. If they say Jesus was not, if they say the virgin birth is a myth, I can't be in unity with that person. If they say Jesus sinned, no, sorry, we can't walk in unity on that. You see, it's more than just agreeing with each other on the way we do things or enjoy things or our values or kind of common outlook on life and stuff like that. Paul said real unity is based on a common theology. Okay? Your methods may be different. That's okay. Every church creates its own culture, its own way of doing things, and that's fine as long as the core is in place. as long as there's a commitment to the core of Christian doctrine. Now, if we break away from that, there's no unity. Or should be no unity. Now, some people today is like, oh, well, we just have to overlook those things for the sake of unity. No, you don't. I think we're coming into a day, hopefully, as Freddie was teaching about this morning about a mature church. This idea of we just all got to get along is not a mature church. A mature church does as Paul and the other New Testament writers told us to do, and when somebody is teaching doctrine contrary to the primaries, or what I call the fundamentals, you got to call them out. You don't want anyone to think that because we're just going to go along to get along with each other. Even the philosopher Plato said, silence is compliance. When you're dealing with people and you may be feeling the pressure, we need to get with this group and that group, but that group doesn't even believe the Holy Spirit exists. Yeah, but we got to get with them so the world will see we're in unity. But we're not. I can't walk in unity with that. Now see, we've been in such a culture, a postmodern culture, that says, everybody's right. You just got to be tolerant and accept what everybody wants. And if you really love Jesus, you'll just go along with it. Find that in the Bible. Paul, especially, he told Peter, call them out. Expose them. If they don't repent, kick them out. So, if we're going to get to that place of maturity, if we're going to get to that place where we do have this unity Paul's talking about, it's not going to be because we have the same order of service or similar views on baptism or whatever. It's going to be because we've got a common doctrine, a commitment to common theology. Well, he goes on to say, verse 7, but to each one of us has been given as Christ to each one of us grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. This is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people. What does he ascended mean? Except that he descended to the lower earthly regions. He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. So part of what he's doing here is alluding to Psalm 68 verse 18, which is a messianic passage in Psalm 68, but he's using it in a different way. And he's using it in a different way because the psalmist was looking forward to the day that this special person, this Messiah figure, was going to come, and these are the things that's going to be associated with him. We're looking back to the fact that he came. When you're looking forward to something, do you know all the details? But when you're looking back, you do. Hindsight 2020. And so they're looking back to what Christ did, and that's what Paul is going to work with here, because what he's about to do here is he's switching gears and he's going to pull out imagery that they would have been familiar with. And that is the image of a Roman general returning from war, having been victorious, and what that looks like. And so what he's saying here in these verses about Jesus went high above, far below, high above. He's covered it all. He's won everything. He captured everything. He defeated Satan in every realm of possibility, and he has taken him captive. That's this imagery of the Roman general returning from battle in what the Roman Empire called a triumph. So I want to give you some information on that. The triumph was one of the highest honors that could be awarded to a military commander and involved a series of elaborate and symbolic rituals and ceremonies. First of all, there was the procession. And in Rome, the triumphal procession was a parade through the streets of Rome leading to the temple of Jupiter. The general would ride a chariot drawn by 4 horses, and the procession included soldiers, or the general's troops dressed in their finest armor, carrying their weapons, marched ahead of the chariot. They sang songs, shouted praises, and celebrated their victory. Captives and spoils were behind the chariot. The captives were usually political prisoners who were taken from among those conquered, along with the spoils, which could be anything from treasures to art to gold to whatever that group of people had, they would take. And then following them would have been senators and officials, Roman senators and officials, who followed along to give added sense of credence to the glory that's being thrown onto the general for what he's accomplished. The general's attire, he'd wear a laurel crown symbolizing victory. He'd wear a purple and gold toga representing his elevated status. His face was painted red, mimicking the appearance of the god Jupiter, emphasizing the general's temporary divine status. The streets of Rome would be lined with citizens who cheered and celebrated the returning hero. Public buildings and homes were decorated, and the atmosphere was festive. Upon reaching the temple of Jupiter, the general would offer sacrifices and prayers, giving thanks to the gods for the victory. This included the sacrifice of animals, offering part of the spoils to the temple, and then they would wrap it all up with a huge series of feasts and banquets. So what you get out of that is the picture of victory. This general would come back in, parade back in with the spoils of war, with the captives behind him, and the people celebrating and cheering because the enemy had been defeated. Paul said, that's your picture. That's what Jesus has done. Now, for a group of people who had been persecuted, who every way they turned, it looked like life was going to be hard and difficult, to be given an image of Jesus as victorious was much different from what they were experiencing at that time. But he wanted to give them this image to get to birth hope in them that what they were going through, they would overcome. And we know some 30 years later, when the book of Revelation is written, they had. Well, how does that relate to Jesus? Well, in verse 8, we see a picture of Jesus as going as low and as high as one can go. And again, that refers to the fact that what Jesus accomplished in redemption was done. Satan was defeated, completely defeated. And it does us good to keep that in mind today, because sometimes I know it's tough when you're facing things in life that are obstacles or challenges, and it's real easy to say, that dirty devil, he's gotten my checkbook again. And I got checks bouncing all over town. Well, it's easier to say that than to say, I need to stop writing checks. Or the devil got in my car. Oh, really? When did you get your oil changed last? Oh, about 5 years ago. Okay, that wasn't the devil. Your motor just locked up. But it's easier to blame everything on the devil as if he's got all this omnipotent power. And we know he's only limited to one place. And for some reason, of all the places he could be in the world, we think he's at the bank messing with my banking account. And see, a lot of what gets blamed on him is really us. But it's easier to blame him. He's not omnipotent. In fact, he's been stripped of everything he had. What did he have? Well, that's the good question. What did he have, and what did Jesus strip him of? He had the law of sin and death, which gave him the power of death over people. When the Bible tells us when we are subject to the law of sin and death, death is at work in us. He had the keys of death and hell. Jesus took them away. Jesus broke that law of sin and death, and now we can be set free and put under the law of the Spirit of life. We don't have to live under that any longer. So when Jesus defeated Satan, he defeated him. And it's not a future thing that someday. He's defeated now. Now, can he get powerful in a person's life? As much power as they'll give him, he'll take. I tell people sometimes, and you keep issuing him an invitation, he's going to take you up on it. But as far as being this omnipotent foe who can just run around willy-nilly and do whatever he wants to do, he's been defeated. So what's our job? Our job is to walk out that victory, to apply that victory to our life, to our sphere of influence. So when it says that Jesus gave grace to his church as he apportioned it, what is it talking about? Two things. One is the grace of salvation, which wasn't possible before the cross. And second, and this is something we may not always think about, but when he took back everything Adam lost and gave that to his church, part of what Adam lost was his purpose for being here. If you read the Genesis account, Adam falls from being a man of purpose and power and authority to being a guy tilling the soil with thorns and thistles. And going from being a man of purpose to being a man who's going to earn his living by the sweat of his brow. See, that imagery wasn't just about you going to live in hot weather. It was about you falling from purpose to toil. And if you've ever had a job you don't like, you know what that's like. Every day you dread it. And so that's what Adam gave up. He gave up his purpose. He gave up his divine assignment to take care of the garden. Adam wasn't told to take care of the world. He was told to take care of a garden. And after he fell, he couldn't do that. But once Jesus took back everything Adam lost, part of what he gave back to the church was our original purpose. And this makes people nervous today because it doesn't fit what they want to be true, which is all that matters right now is that you get saved and hang on for heaven. And one of these days you're going to get zapped out of here and you're going to land in heaven, and God's just so happy that you decided to go his way. He's going to throw all these blessings on top of you, and then you're going to live the victorious life. Well, you can't help but live a victorious life in heaven. Everybody gets that in heaven. So all that about living a victorious life applies here. So we've got the original purpose for humanity that's been given back, and God has apportioned to each of us the assignment he had in mind for us. God's put something in each one of us that's needed right now in human history. If it were needed 100 years from now, you'd have been born then. If it were needed 100 years ago, you'd have been born then. But there's something in each of us right now that God wants us to invest in our garden. Now see, if that ever clicks And we can get out of this mindset that as Christians, we're just here to try to be holy and hold it together till we can get to heaven. If we see that God has put something within us to do now in the way of fulfilling our part of advancing His kingdom in this world, then we are reclaiming part of what Christ brought back when He defeated Satan. But the flip side to that is, if we don't reclaim it, we're just giving it back to Satan. And he'll use it or misuse it. And there's a reason why our culture today is in the mess it's in. You can't get angry at lost folks for acting like lost folks. You can get angry at Christian folks for not acting like Christian folks. We gave up being salt and light years ago. And I think Dutch Sheets did an excellent piece on that a few months ago when he talked about how the church had a golden opportunity coming out of the 60s and 70s to really advance the kingdom in this country. But they blew it. And instead of advancing the kingdom, a few voices got into that movement and convinced everybody to give up on this world and wait for the next, which they were going imminently enter. So why bother? Let the world go to hell. I'm not, so who cares? So while they were making converts, as Dutch Sheet said, they were making converts, the enemies of Christ were making disciples. They were discipling people in the schools. They were starting to disciple people in the culture. They were causing them to think. Do you remember back in the early 70s when they kicked prayer out of school? And I'm not saying that prayer in the school is the magic bullet to fix it all. I'm saying that that's just a symptom of the shift. 1973, Roe v. Wade. The symptom of a shift. And so as you look back and you see how things have advanced since, look at where we are today. Where we are today is not by accident. It's the natural progression of a lack of salt. And sadly, we still have people who are just huddled up. Oh, I hope Jesus comes back real quick. Get me out of here before it gets too bad. How much worse does it got to get? Well, now, I'm not saying that I'm worried about how bad it could get in my life, but I'm concerned about how bad it can get in my grandkids' life. And don't think just because we have church, that's going to change the world. It won't. There's no church in this country that's got it going on so much that they can turn this country around. It's going to take people willing to be salt and light, willing to embrace that original assignment that Jesus brought back from the enemy. Well, I got off my notes, so I forget where I am, but that's okay. Well, verse 8, he says that Jesus took captives. Who were the captives? Well, like the Roman general would take all the leadership of the conquered people and make them his slave, Jesus took all of Satan and his leadership and made them his slaves. They're defeated. So, we have the victory is what Paul is saying. You've got the victory, now walk in it. So what's our takeaways? I'll give you 3 and we're done. Number 1, we should live worthy of the calling to salvation we receive. And that's more than just be nice and be sweet. It does involve matters of character, but it also involves matters of being strategic in what we do. Redeem the time. Look at what God's called you to do. He may have given you a break for a reason. There may be something that he knew if you didn't have this break, you would never get to. And so, live a life worthy of the calling. Number 2, in giving grace, Jesus made redemption possible, but he also restored God's original assignments to his people. So don't bury your treasure. And no hanging around just trying to be holy is not the assignment. Number 3, and I'm always reminded of those 2 sisters in the Wales revival who could not leave their house. They were homebound. One of them couldn't stand up straight and the other one was blind. And they said, well, we can't go nowhere, but we're going to do something here. And they made their house a prayer chapel. And they started praying for revival. And the revival came, and everyone involved in the revival said it's because of these 2 old ladies who could not get out of the house anymore. So don't tell me I can't do anything. I'm this old now. You're still here. You're still breathing. You can do something. Pray. It don't take a whole lot for that. And it's so desperately needed. Pray that those who can get around and do stuff and are still engaged in, pray that they'll be salt. Pray that they'll have the courage to do what needs to be done, to say what needs to be said, even if it's not popular. And I can tell you, if you tell people the truth, it's not going to be popular. Number 3, Christ's victory was complete. So we are enforcing the victory in our world and in this chapter of God's redemptive plan. Satan's not waiting to be defeated. He already has been. And that was Paul's point to these people who were feeling pretty overwhelmed by what was going on. Paul said, guys, don't lose sight of the fact Satan's been defeated. Jesus already won. And you're in him, so guess what? You won. But my circumstances haven't changed. Keep praying. Keep believing. Keep acting like someone worthy of the calling. And like I said, we know about 30 years later, they overcame it. Their culture hadn't changed a lot, but the church had grown tremendously to the point the opposition backed off. And by that time, the church had become so truth-hardened and truth-devoted that they had to be rebuked because they'd lost their love for people. They were just, get in or get out. Turn or burn, brother. And I don't really care. You know, and they'd gotten so hard. John said, hey, man, you guys are at the top of the chart on calling out false teachers and exposing things that shouldn't be taught in the church, exposing all this. And you guys, y'all got it going on that, but whew, you lost your love along the way. You're slicing and dicing, but not giving much mercy anywhere. So my prayer for us today as we finish out, as we're moving towards finishing out Ephesians, is recognize what Paul was trying to get across to the Ephesians. Satan's been defeated. We can act like it. There's another fallacy going around today in some circles, that because they've created a dichotomy where God, he just does good stuff, so any bad stuff in your life, well, that ain't God. Well, where's it coming from then? Well, it's coming from the devil. Yeah, it's the devil. And so what they end up doing is they create a devil who's equal with God. And then the solution is, if you're needing some kind of breakthrough, is you and God have just got to lock arms, and maybe together the two of you can beat Satan back. And that's not true. You know, sometimes God allows Satan to do some things in our lives, or allows hardships to come, whatever the case may be. And it isn't the devil at all, it's us. We won't listen. We won't obey. We won't do what he says. But sometimes he'll allow stuff to come because it has to do with character formation and developing perseverance in us. Now, we don't like that, but we have to read James. Because James said, that's why. Sometimes it comes to build faith. Sometimes it comes to give us some practice kicking the devil. You know, it's okay to kick him. You want to really kick him? Quote scriptures to him about how he's defeated. He hates that. You know, demons won't hang around people who are positive for very long. They got to get you down. And if they can ever get you down, they'll bully you. They'll get on top of you and they'll start bullying you. Well, my prayer for us today is that we'll leave here confident, more confident than ever in the fact Satan's defeated. God does have a plan for us. God has restored the original design to us. God has given us divine assignments. It may not be what he gave you years ago, but he's got something for us. And so we just need to use it. We just need to do it. We need to obey. We need to do what God's called us to do. And I think if we do, we're going to see some breakthroughs. Father, thank you for today. Thank you so much for your word. Help us, Lord, to see that you are victorious, that we're not waiting for you to win in the future. You've already won. So, Lord, help us to walk in that victory as we may be facing things today in our lives that are challenges. And, Lord, if it's a challenge that's a result of something that we're doing, help us to see what to do to change. But, Lord, if it's just something that's being used for training in our lives, help us to see what it is so that we can get on board with what you're trying to develop in us. Lord, I thank you. Thank you so much for your grace, for your mercy, for your patience. And Lord, I pray your blessing on each person here today and on their families. And I pray they'll prosper and be in health as their souls prosper. Amen. Bless you. Remember tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, Fellowship Hall for prayer. Wednesday night we'll be here at 7. I think that was it by way of announcement. All right. Be blessed.